It's an exciting day when we have our kids up here and find out what they've been learning. You know, speaking of kids, this little kid here was at school one day, and he says, one day our teacher asked what my favorite animal was, and I said, fried chicken. Well, she said I wasn't funny, but she couldn't have been right because everybody else laughed. Well, my parents always told me to tell the truth, and I did. Fried chicken is my favorite animal. Well, anyway, the teacher sent me to the principal's office. I told him what happened, and he laughed too. Then he told me not to do it again. Well, the next day in class, my teacher asked me what my favorite live animal was. So I told her it was chicken. She asked me why, and I said, because I can make him into fried chicken. Yeah, she sent me back to the principal's office. He laughed and told me not to do it again. I don't understand. My parents taught me to be honest, but my teacher doesn't like it when I am. Today, my teacher asked me to tell her what famous military person I admired the most. I told her, Colonel Sanders. Guess where I am now? All right. You know, it is always a treat to see what our kids are learning. And by the way, I don't know if you caught it in the video, but all these posters around here, check them out after the service. They're all questions that the BreakOut kids have been working on learning all year long. And it's pretty extensive and a pretty in-depth study that they've been doing. And, you know, Lori and Hillary and Corbett and Nick have some very lofty goals for their ministry to our church's youth. But as we've talked about in the past, their best efforts really pale in comparison to the influence that parents and grandparents have on the spiritual development of our kids. So let me ask you a personal question. Don't say it out loud, and don't have to raise your hand, but this applies to parents who are in the process right now of raising their kids. It applies to those of you who will someday in the future become parents, and even those of us who are grandparents. What is your goal for your kids? If everything goes exactly like you hope it will, what will it look like? What's the bullseye that you're aiming at with respect to your kids? You know, the hope of most parents is that their kids will grow up and have successful, comfortable, happy lives. We just want our kids to be happy. May I suggest a more worthwhile goal this morning? Aim for them to be like the young David that we see in 1 Samuel 17. And I believe that we can relate much of his story to our kids. Before we dive into the chapter, though, I want to kind of look at the setting, what's going on here, and kind of put it into its context. Leading up to this chapter, God had declared that he had rejected Saul as king over Israel, and that he had chosen a new man who would eventually lead the nation. A man with the heart of a warrior and an unshakable confidence in God, and that man was David. Chapter 17 opens with the armies of the Philistines and the army of Israel lined up across from one another at the valley of Elah. The Philistines occupy a hill on one side of the valley, and Israel occupies a hill on the opposite side. They're not doing much fighting, but they are talking a lot of smack. And in verse 4 of chapter 17, we're introduced to a very intimidating opponent. Verse 4 says, a champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze, weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. Goliath is like an ancient version of an Abrams tank. He's over 9 feet tall. His armor weighs 125 pounds. His spear weighs over 15 pounds. He's protected by full body armor, and he has a man with a shield advancing in front of him. He is an intimidating figure. Verse 8, Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he's able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." Then the Philistine said, "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. So there you have it. The armies are lined up against each other, talking smack to one another. But when Goliath comes out and issues his taunt, Saul, the king, and the rest of the army, New Living Translation says they were terrified and deeply shaken. They were shaken in their boots. Goliath comes out and tells every yo mama joke he can think of, and they are scared to death. Well, then we're introduced to David. It says there in verse 12, "Now David was the son of an Ephrathite named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem in Judah. Jesse had 8 sons, and in Saul's time he was very old. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to the war. The firstborn was Eliab, the second Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to tending his father's sheep at Bethlehem." Now, David wasn't a soldier at that time, but according to chapter 16, he was Saul's armor bearer. And so he went back and forth between serving Saul and helping his father. Now, Israelites were told under the age of 20 at that time didn't serve in the army. So we can infer that David's 3 older brothers here were at least in their 20s. And from that aspect, commentators speculate that David is probably in his late teens. And verse 16 says, "For 40 days the Philistine came forward every evening and every morning and took his stand." Meanwhile, back at the farm, Jesse, David's dad, tells him, take some supplies to his brothers and see how they're doing. So this smack talk goes on for 40 days, and then David arrives on the scene. He reached the camp of the Philistines, as the army was going out to its battle position, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines facing each other. David left his things with the keeper of supplies, ran to the battle lines, and asked his brothers how they were. As he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance. And David heard it. Whenever the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear. Now the Israelites had been saying, "Do you see how this man keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. The king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He will also give him his daughter in marriage and will exempt his family from taxes in Israel." Yeah, what's not to love about that? Goliath must have really been scary that nobody wanted to take that on. And so David asked the men standing near him, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" Well, then Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, and he burned with anger at him and asked, "Why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle." "Now what have I done?" David asked. Can't I even speak?" So then he turned away to someone else and brought up the same matter, and the men answered him as before. What David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. Doesn't Eliab's reaction seem a little odd to you? My guess is that it's probably coming from embarrassment and jealousy. Eliab, he was a pretty impressive guy in his own right. After God had rejected Saul as king, he sent Samuel, remember, to Jesse to anoint the man who would be king after him. And in chapter 16, verses 6 and 7, we read, when Samuel saw Eliab, he thought, wow, surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord. This has got to be the guy. Look at him. He is a specimen. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. So Eliab, man, he's got the looks, he's got the stature, but he doesn't have the heart, as he proves here. He's running away just like the rest of them. David is young, late teens, but he has a warrior's heart and an unshakable confidence in God. And so now in the rest of the chapter, we get a peek into David's heart. And I think we need to find a way to instill the qualities that we see in David here, instill those qualities in our kids. Verse 34 through 37, we see one of the main things here is that he is prepared for battle. David said to Saul, let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him. Think about that for a minute. Here's an army of seasoned warriors cowering in fear, shaking in their boots, and this brash teenager says, no problem, I'll fight him. What? Saul replied, you're not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You're only a youth. And he's been a warrior from his youth. But David's words really aren't just empty bragging. He's been put to the test, and he is prepared for the battle. So David says to Saul, he says, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord, who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear, will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. So Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. In other words, it's your funeral, kid. Have at it. Well, in verses 38 through 40, we see something that's very, very important, not only to David, but I think to our kids, and that is his faith is not a borrowed faith. He has an unshakable confidence in God because of his firsthand experience with God. And you see that the thing to remember here is that secondhand faith isn't adequate. Then Saul, we're told, dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened his sword over the tunic and tried walking around in them because he wasn't used to them. So Saul puts his armor and all that stuff on David. David says, I can't go out in these because I'm not used to them. So he took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in hand, approached the Philistine. Now, I need to correct centuries of artist misconceptions and Sunday school material. We're told that David was like this 5'0" 10-year-old that went out there and beat the giant instead. But we're told earlier in the book of 1 Samuel that Saul stood head and shoulders above most men in Israel, and he's not stupid. He dresses David in his own armor because David's a big kid. He may be young, but he's big. And so David doesn't reject Saul's armor because it doesn't fit. He rejects it because he wasn't used to it. And David is totally prepared for the challenge. He's experienced God's hand in previous impossible circumstances, but he can't go out to battle in somebody else's gear. And there's a real similarity here with our kids. They can't borrow your faith. They have to develop their own. And one of the reasons given by students for abandoning their faith is that they never personally owned it in the first place. I would encourage you to visit the Faith at Home Resource Center back there in the back of the back room after the service, and I've printed and put an article in there entitled, "The Number One Sign Your Kids Are Just Borrowing Your Faith and Not Developing Their Own." And it's one of many resources, and it's free. So go back there and check that out. Verse 41, we see David's courage on display. He is not intimidated by Goliath's size, his armor, or his threats. It says there in verse 41, meanwhile, the Philistine, with his shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, am I a dog that you come out at me with sticks? And he cursed David by his gods. Come here, he said, I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals. See, he's insulted that this snot-nosed kid would dare challenge him. Now, picture this. Your little Susie is sitting in her biology class listening to her teacher state that evolution is a proven fact, and she has the audacity to question him. She'll get the same response David gets from Goliath. So she needs to be prepared for it, or else she will wilt under the pressure like Saul and his army did. But here is the real key to David's confidence and his courage. He has a clear understanding of who God is. There we go. David said to the Philistine, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will give you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. And those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. Yet there's a huge difference here between David's perspective and everybody else there. Goliath, in David's mind, is not defying the armies of Saul. He's not defying the armies of Israel. He's defying the armies of the living God. He's got some pretty sound theology behind him. And there's something to remember here for us too, I think. When skeptics attack our faith and try to tear down the faith of our kids, they're not attacking us. They're not attacking our church. They're attacking the living God, and it's not going to go well with them. So verse 48, we see maybe an unintended consequence, but a pretty valuable one nonetheless. His bold faith and his bold actions inspire and encourage others. It says there in verse 48, as the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. So because he is totally prepared, and because he has an unshakable confidence in God, he takes the fight to Goliath. He doesn't just sit there passively hoping to defend himself. He goes on the offensive. And reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. David ran and stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword and drew it from the sheath. After killing him, he cut off his head with a sword. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they turned and ran. Then the men of Israel and Judah surged forward with a shout and pursued the Philistines to the entrance of Gath, to the gates of Ekron. Their dead were strewn all along the road to Gath and Ekron. And then David, verse 54, took the Philistine's head and brought it to Jerusalem. He put the Philistines' weapons in his own tent. You know, it goes to show you never know what teenagers are going to bring home, do you? Whew. That's one gift they can leave out there, as far as I'm concerned. Now, as I said earlier, and really take this to heart, if your goal is for your kids to have successful, comfortable, happy lives, you're aiming at the wrong target. Instead of asking, what will make my kids comfortable and happy, you should be asking, what will make my kids dangerous? And instead of, what will help my kids survive? Ask yourself, what do I need to instill in them to make it difficult for the secular world to survive them? A much different goal, isn't it? Yeah. Our kids need to be prepared for battle just as much as David did. Well, why does this matter? Well, Natasha Crane, in her book, Keeping Your Kids on God's Side, which is a series, or we just finished a book study, 12-week study, apologetic study going through this book. And we have one on display back there if you want to go check it out later. Listen to what she says in the introduction here. She says, I didn't learn about the evidence for evolution until I was in my 30s. When I did, it rocked my lifelong faith in a matter of hours. I started studying evolution by reading an online series of introductory articles. After studying just 8 lessons one day, I numbly shut down my computer, pulled a blanket over my head, and felt years of faith sheepishly slink into the shadows of my newfound knowledge. The evidence was shockingly vast, far more extensive than I had ever imagined. The details were fascinating and compelling. This wasn't some half-baked idea about how fossils fit together, as I had previously imagined. It was completely scientific, as scientific as any other science I had ever studied and assumed to be valid. It was hardly a leap to ask myself, why shouldn't I accept this science if I accept all other science I've been taught? I felt like I couldn't breathe for hours as I lay pondering what life would look like without the God I had always believed in. Now, it's important to know that this one night when evolution floored me came after, listen to this, after I had attended church for 30 plus years, served as a youth group leader, taken numerous Sunday school classes, read the Bible regularly, and engaged in an active prayer life. None of those things prepared me to figure out what I should do with the evidence for evolution. If evolution was true, I had no idea how Christianity could be true at the same time. If evolution was not true, I had no idea how there could be so much evidence for it. It was devastating. Now, this is a 30-year-old woman. This isn't some teenager in a high school class. And here's a sample of what your kids are and will face when they sit in their high school or college biology classes if they express belief in creation, especially. And this is just a small sampling of the responses that Crane received when she posted one of her early blogs on about creation. Some of the comments were, yeah, facts and rational thought aren't very important for these crazies. Intelligent and religious are mutually exclusive. There's no God. End of debate. Please don't tell me these people actually believe this. Debating a Christian is impossible. They rely on faith, which is fantasy, where an atheist relies on evidence. Richard Dawkins defined faith as delusion. And then remember, these folks are breeding. And then there's good old Bill Nye, the science guy. He said, here's hoping we can work together to bring the children of the creationist preachers' flocks to a more enlightened, boundless way of thinking about the world around us. Now, hear me. If you do not equip your kids with robust spiritual training, it's like sending them into a gunfight armed with a butter knife. The world in which our kids are immersed is intimidating, it's overwhelmingly pervasive, and it is determined to destroy our faith. So prepare them for battle. Prepare them for the fight of their life, not a life of comfort and happiness. In his book, a guy who's becoming one of my favorite writers, former homicide detective J. Warner Wallace, writes in Forensic Faith. He says, I'll never forget my first year with junior and senior high schoolers. It was mostly a train wreck. I struggled to find my voice and understand my mission, and after graduating the first group of seniors, I discovered that all but one had walked away from their faith by winter break of their freshman year in college. I was shocked and felt like a complete failure. In that first year, I focused on my gifting as an artist and musician rather than on my skill set as a detective. As a new youth pastor, I exercised this gifting and created weekly experiences for my kids. Music, imagery, and environment were important to me as I walked through the scripture with my youth. The ministry grew quickly, and it seemed successful. at least by the metrics we often use to measure success. But once I realized our graduating seniors were no longer Christians, I knew I had to shift gears. We needed to stop teaching. We've got lots of great teachers in the church, lots of concerned parents who want to teach their kids. We've been teaching young people for generations. But this teaching has obviously become ineffective. If the current statistics related to the departure rates of young people in their college years are even remotely accurate. We've been teaching, and students have been leaving. It's time to stop teaching and start training. Researchers have been studying the spiritual life and vitality of teenagers' faith for at least the last 20 years, and most come up with similar statistics as the Southern Baptist Convention's 2001 study. 70% of teenagers involved in church youth groups stop attending church within 2 years of their high school graduation. Some research indicates that the dropout rate may be as high as 90%. Now, if you'd like to read more, I have printed really an extensive article with extensive research listed in there titled, Are Young People Really Leaving Christianity? It's in the Faith at Home Center, and you can go pick one up absolutely free as long as supplies last. And I can print more if need be. It's 20 pages, so I'm not sure many of you will grab one. In her book, Keeping Kids on God's Side, Crane asks the question, why is this happening? Good question. Why is this happening? She says, having studied the various survey results in depth, I think it's fair to summarize the collective problem in one sentence. A lack of robust spiritual training has resulted in a featherweight faith for many of today's young adults, and that faith is being blown away by attacks from our secular culture. And then in a book that was just released, I think 1st of May, Sean McDowell and J. Warner Wallace, So the Next Generation Will Know, Preparing Young Christians for a Challenging World, they write this: the reality is, we don't parent our kids for long, and we only get one chance to guide them through their elementary, junior high, and high school years. This season passes quickly and requires intentionality. While true for our biological children, it's also true for the young people in our church family. The next generation of Christians faces spiritual, emotional, intellectual, and moral challenges like no prior group of believers. And much of this is because of the ubiquity of technology. Members of Generation Z face more challenges just one click away than previous generations did when they looked for it. Okay, that's the bad news. What can we do about it? What can we do to prepare our kids for the battle ahead? Natasha Crane gives us 10 tips for having deeper faith conversations with your kids. We've made those into a bookmark and put them in the Faith at Home Center. So you can go back there and pick one up, and it'll be a constant reminder. Number 1, commit to deepening your understanding of Christianity and the arguments that skeptics use to undermine it. See, you cannot give what you do not possess yourself. And this is absolutely critical, parents, grandparents. You cannot outsource this. As hard as Corbett and Lori work to inculcate faith in our kids, it doesn't even come close to the influence and the opportunity and the time that you have with your kids. The responsibility lies on you. We are a support structure for you. And hear me, the problem is not a lack of information. The problem is a shameful lack of motivation. There is literally more information, most of which is free, and a lot of it is back in the Faith at Home Center. And all of those resources contain links to even more resources than you can read in a year. Now, there are 3 books that I have really grown to love, and I've Actually, I've read all 6 of them, the kids' versions too. The kids' versions are much easier for me to understand, so I really like those. But the 3 are J. Warner Wallace. The first one, God's Crime Scene. That's where I would start. This deals with the issue of the existence of God. The second one is Cold Case Christianity. This is another important book after you settled on the idea that there is a God, because it deals with the validity of the New Testament and the validity of Christ's identity and his resurrection. And if you're here because your kids or grandkids are here, so you came to church today and you're a skeptic, great, no problem. Pick up one of these books and check it out. If you're skeptical about even the existence of God, don't accept the non-existence of God on blind faith. We're accused of believing in God because of an exercise of blind faith. Well, guess what? If you disbelieve in the existence of God, you're accepting it by blind faith too. Go check it out. Interestingly, a lot of the people writing these books were former skeptics that went about trying to disprove Christianity. And the evidence was so overwhelming, they could do nothing but accept it. In fact, Wallace says, I didn't become a Christian. He was a firm, antagonistic atheist until he was in his 30s. He says, I didn't become a Christian because I wanted to go to heaven and I feared hell. I didn't believe in either one of them. And I was okay with just being buried and becoming worm food. He says, I became a Christian because I researched it and it's true. And all 3 of these claims the Bible from a detective's perspective. That's what I like about his writings. He's examining the claims of Christianity, the claims of the Scriptures, as if he was examining a cold case homicide case. And he goes through the same process, same procedures. Really great reads. Also, as you can see there on the screen, available in kids' versions. There's no good reason why your kids should grow up with a featherweight faith. There's enough information out there for you to bury you in. Number 2, make spiritual space in your home. What she means by that is include dedicated time in your schedule for your family to work on growing in your understanding and your relationship with God together. Don't try to outsource it. It won't work. You are the primary influencer in the spiritual development of your kids. If we value our kids, either as parents, youth workers, Sunday school teachers, or fellow members of Sierra, now is the time to refocus our priorities and our calendars. To refocus how we spend our time, money, and our energy. However, prioritizing young people is going to require us to defer our desires and instead to do what's best for them, even though at times it's going to be inconvenient for us. McDowell and Wallace write, our sacrifices reveal our priorities. If we truly love the next generation, we'll do whatever it takes to make sure they know and embrace the truth. Number 3 is related to number 2, study the Bible with your kids. So study apologetics, reasons for your beliefs, and study the Bible. Another great resource, it's not written down anywhere, but go on to YouTube. I think your kids at least know how to get to YouTube. Go on YouTube and search the Bible Project. There is a host of material there. They go through every single book of the Bible and give you a visual overview of the book so you understand what's going on there, how it's written, how to interpret it. There's issues there, how to read the Bible, what is the Bible, and all these different themes that go through the Bible are covered in that website. There's also studies of key words in the Bible, and it's all free. We support them as a church. So you can go on there and download and listen to your heart's content. It's free. Great resource. Number four, proactively and regularly ask your kids what questions they have. Don't wait for them to ask because there are a lot of reasons why they might not ask. Don't assume anything. Number 5, ask your kids the tough questions that they don't ask you. If they don't bring things up, you bring it up. Challenge them. Challenge their faith in the safety of your home and in the security of your relationship with them. The Navy SEALs have a saying, sweat in training or bleed in combat. That's what we're talking about here. Number 6, if your kids are struggling with their faith, become a detective. Find out why. What are the underlying issues to their struggles? Number 7, emphasize critical thinking skills. Critical thinking seems to have become a lost art in our culture. Again, back in the Faith at Home Center, we've printed out some copies of Natasha Crane's article, How I'm Teaching My 6-Year-Olds to Be Critical Thinkers. They're never too young. Number 8, work with your kids on how to seek answers to faith questions online. And many of those resources that we have in the center have links to other resources, books, etc., online as well. Number 9, teach your kids about religions and worldviews other than Christianity. Help them evaluate the claims of other worldviews and religions, and so that they understand why we might reject them. A great resource for that is Greg Kuchel's book, The Story of Reality. It really walks you through how to think through these issues. And he looks at the big worldview questions in that book. Great read. I've gone through it twice now. Number 10, start today. McDowell and Wallace write, most young people abandon their Christian faith while they're still at home with their parents. They don't wait till college. Today, incoming freshmen, when surveyed before they enter college, are 3 times more likely to report that they're religiously unaffiliated than freshmen who entered college in 1986. 79% of these young people say they walked away from Christianity during their adolescent and teen years. Many reported that they left the faith between the ages of 10 and 17. So the dropout rate is going up, and the age at which many of the kids are dropping out is going down. And I'll throw in an extra bonus. It's not on the bookmark. Number 11, teach them to ask questions that expose the weaknesses of the claims being made against their faith. We've got 1 Peter 3 up here. Verse 13, Peter asks, who's going to harm you if you're eager to do good? Answer, anyone with whom you disagree about worldview issues. They all will. But he says in verse 14, even if you should suffer for what is right, you're blessed. Do not fear their threats. Do not be frightened. But in your hearts, revere Christ as Lord, just like David did. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander. Now, how can a teenager go toe-to-toe with an authority figure like a biology teacher or professor with gentleness and respect? So in reality, if they try to match arguments with their teachers, they're probably going to lose. They need to know more than the arguments for their faith. See, every theory, every idea has strengths and weaknesses. They need to learn to ask questions that expose the weaknesses of the claims being made against their faith. That's how they can approach it in respect and gentleness. For example, when the teacher, claims emphatically that life evolved from simple to complex forms, they might respectfully ask, how does that square with the second law of thermodynamics that says everything is just the opposite? It goes from complex to simple. Questions are often used to create doubt in our student's mind, but questions work both ways. And your student may not get very far with the teacher, but their boldness in even asking the question might inspire and encourage fellow students in the class. Well, it's not hopeless. Might feel like it, but it's not. Wallace and McDowell write, young people who leave the church are still interested in spiritual things. They're not lost causes. They are willing to listen if we will listen first. In fact, the act of listening is at the core of the solution. Looking at the data, one might conclude that the church simply needs to do a better job of teaching truth and making a case for Christianity. But that's only part of the answer. Young people are seeking reasonable explanations, explanations that make sense, explanations that are based on evidence, and authentic relationships. These are the two inseparable rails that will lead toward a solution. The task to which we as parents, grandparents, and a church family to which we're called is a difficult one, and it will require dogged determination, hard work, and a different outlook on how we spend our time and our money. But as Teddy Roosevelt said, nothing in the world is worth having or worth doing unless it means effort, pain, and difficulty. I have never in my life envied a human being who led an easy life. I have envied a great many people who led difficult lives and led them well. Prepare your children for battle. Don't ask, what will help my kids survive? Ask, what do I need to instill in them to make it difficult for the secular world, to make it difficult for Goliath to survive them? Let's pray. Lord, you have given us everything we need pertaining to life and godliness. So I ask you to light a fire in us. Stir our hearts to work relentlessly to first equip ourselves so that we may be able to equip our children and the children of our church, so that the whole world will know there is a God in South Lake Tahoe. Amen.